Welcome to another deep dive.
Hmm.
This time, we're going to get into something I always thought was pretty interesting, plant reproduction,
Yeah.
focusing specifically on flowering plants. Um, I provided you with this textbook excerpt, right?
Yeah.
It compares the biology of reproduction in flowering plants and in humans.
Interesting.
And I guess I have wondered why flowers are so colorful and fragrant, right? It can't just be for us.
Well, yeah, from like a strictly biological perspective, those vibrant colors, those intoxicating scents, they're not just there for our enjoyment. It's part of a strategy for survival. Right?
Yeah, okay. I get that, all living things want to pass on their genes, right? But why is sexual reproduction so important? It just seems like so much more effort than just cloning yourself.
I think that's a great question. And, cloning might seem, easier on the surface, but what it does is create a population that's just identical to each other. Right. So sexual reproduction, on the other hand, is constantly shuffling this deck of cards, right? So it creates these variations, so at least some offspring will have the traits they need to survive as the environment changes.
Yeah.
Imagine if everyone had the same immune system.
Uh-oh.
One superbug could wipe us all out. So diversity
Makes sense.
is key for resilience.
Yeah, like nature's way of hedging its bets.
Exactly.
And flowers are like kind of the main stage, right? For all this genetic mixing and matching to happen in the plant world.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so it's more than just pretty decorations then.
Definitely.
So I guess let's get into the nitty-gritty here.
Okay.
The textbook mentions these male and female parts of a flower. And it always felt a little strange to me to apply those terms to plants.
Yeah, it is a little, it's an analogy, right? It's a useful one, though,
Okay.
because just like in humans, you need the contributions from both, what we're calling male and female for sexual reproduction to work. And so in a flower, the male reproductive organ is called the androecium, which is composed of, one or more stamens.
And each stamen has an anther on it, right?
Yeah.
Which is where the pollen is produced. And I'm already feeling my hay fever.
Oh, are you allergic?
Oh, yeah.
Pollen is definitely a notorious allergen for some people, but from the plant's perspective, it's very precious cargo, right?
Right.
Inside the anther, there are these pollen sacs where pollen grains develop through this process called microsporogenesis.
Microsporogenesis.
Yeah, so think of these like tiny factories churning out these microscopic capsules of genetic material.
I've heard that pollen can survive for a really long time.
It's true.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Really?
Pollen grains have this unbelievably tough outer layer called the exine, and it's made of sporopollenin.
Or pollen.
Yeah, and this stuff is so resilient that it can survive for thousands of years, even in like really harsh conditions.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so scientists have been able to extract pollen from ancient sediment layers and use that to, reconstruct past environments, track changes in vegetation over time.
So like a time capsule almost.
Yeah, it's like a time capsule of botanical history.
It makes sense then that scientists would create these pollen banks
Yeah.
to preserve plant diversity, just like we have seed banks.
Exactly. They're, so valuable as a resource for conservation and research.
Absolutely.
And, they could be really crucial for developing new crop varieties that are resistant to, disease or climate change.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the male side of things, I guess. Let's talk about the female reproductive parts.
Okay.
The textbook mentions the gynoecium.
The gynoecium.
Which I vaguely remember from, high school biology.
Yeah.
But it's probably been a while for most of our listeners, too.
So the gynoecium is composed of one or more pistils.
Okay.
And each pistil has three main parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary.
And each ovule is like a potential seed, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And inside each ovule, this special process happens called megasporogenesis.
Megasporogenesis.
Yeah.
I'm never going to remember that.
And it leads to the development of this embryo sac.
Right.
Which is, it's like a nursery, right,
Okay.
for the egg cell. And it provides everything that it needs to develop into a new plant, if it gets fertilized.
So the embryo sac is kind of like the female equivalent of the pollen grain.
Yeah.
They both carry that genetic material needed to make a new plant.
You got it. And both the pollen grain and the embryo sac are the products of this special type of cell division
Okay.
called meiosis.
Right.
Which halves the number of chromosomes, right?
Right.
Which is crucial because when the male and female gametes fuse during fertilization,
Yeah.
the full chromosome number is restored.
It's like two halves coming together to make a whole. But how do these tiny gametes, like tucked away in all these structures, actually find each other?
That's where the next chapter of our story unfolds.
Right.
That's pollination.
Pollination.
Yes.
We're going to need to take a break.
Okay.
We'll be back in just a minute.
Sounds good. So pollination.
Yeah, pollination. It's like the ultimate plant meet cute.
Yeah.
You know, where those tiny pollen grains finally get to meet with the embryo sac.
Yeah.
You know, I have to admit, when I think about pollination,
Yeah.
my mind immediately goes to bees.
Sure.
Buzzing around a field of flowers.
Bees are definitely important pollinators.
Yeah.
But, the world of pollination is much more diverse than that.
Okay.
You can think of it as this, vast matchmaking network with all these different characters, from tiny insects to big mammals.
Flat.
And even, the forces of nature themselves.
So it's not all about the bees then?
Not at all.
What are some of the other matchmakers out there?
Well, we can classify pollination into two main types.
Okay.
Abiotic.
Abiotic.
Biotic, okay. So abiotic pollination relies on non-living forces like wind and water.
Okay, like a message in a bottle, but with pollen instead of a love letter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So think about grasses.
Yeah.
They have these feathery stigmas
Okay.
that wave in the wind, so they can catch those pollen grains that are carried on the breeze.
Okay.
Or you can think about Vallisneria. That's an aquatic plant where the male flowers actually detach.
What?
Yeah. And float on the water's surface, hoping to bump into a female flower to deliver their pollen.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so abiotic pollination
Yeah.
is all about these chance encounters.
Okay, so that's abiotic.
Yeah.
What about biotic then?
Biotic pollination is where the real drama unfolds.
Okay.
This is where animals come in. So, picture a hummingbird
Yeah.
flitting from flower to flower.
Yeah.
Its long beak, perfectly adapted to sip nectar, right?
Yeah.
While it's inadvertently picking up pollen, transferring it to the next bloom. Or imagine a bat, visiting a night-blooming cactus drawn by its, heady fragrance and its sweet nectar.
Yeah.
So they all play a part.
Okay, it sounds like a beautifully choreographed dance.
It is.
And I guess that's where those, colorful petals and those alluring fragrances come in, right?
Yeah.
Flowers have to make themselves stand out if they want to attract those pollinators.
Exactly. Flowers have evolved, this incredible array of adaptations
Wow.
to entice their preferred pollinators.
Okay.
So color is a big one.
Yeah.
Bees are attracted to bright yellows
Right.
and blues,
Okay.
while birds are drawn to reds and oranges.
Makes sense.
Fragrance also plays a big role.
Yeah.
Some flowers release their perfume during the day to attract daytime pollinators,
Right.
while others save their fragrant allure for the night to entice moths or bats.
So it's a whole sensory experience to attract a specific audience.
Yeah.
But wouldn't some animals try to cheat the system? Take the nectar but not transfer any pollen?
You've hit upon a fascinating aspect of coevolution. There's always this arms race, right?
Gross.
Between plants and their pollinators.
Yeah.
Some animals, we call them nectar robbers.
Okay, nectar robbers.
They try to steal those sweet rewards without, providing any pollination services in return.
It's like a botanical dine and dash.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But plants have evolved counter strategies.
Oh.
So some have developed thicker floral tissues to deter robbers.
Okay.
While others have, really intricate floral structures that force visiting animals to brush against those pollen-bearing parts.
So it's this constant back and forth.
Yeah.
This interplay between attraction and defense.
It makes you realize just how intricate
It is.
and dynamic the natural world is.
Absolutely.
But back to the main event here. Pollination.
Okay.
Let's say a pollen grain has successfully landed on the stigma
Yeah.
of a compatible flower.
Okay.
What happens next?
This is where things get, even more intricate.
Okay.
So not just any pollen grain can fertilize any flower. Right.
Right.
Plants have evolved these mechanisms to avoid inbreeding.
Okay, so that's when they reproduce with closely related individuals.
Right.
It's kind of like why, in humans,
Yeah.
we discourage marriage between close relatives, right?
Exactly.
To avoid genetic problems.
Right. Inbreeding leads to, a less diverse gene pool, right?
Yeah.
Which makes a population more susceptible to diseases and less adaptable to change.
So how do plants avoid, accidentally self-pollinating?
Well, one way is through timing.
Okay.
So the pollen might be released at a different time than when the stigma is receptive.
Okay.
Another strategy is spatial separation.
Okay.
So the anthers, which produce the pollen, might be positioned far away from the stigma
Okay.
within the flower.
Got it.
Or the flower might have this structure that physically prevents pollen from reaching its own stigma.
Okay, so it's like a built-in system to ensure outbreeding.
Yeah, and there's another one.
That's even more fascinating.
What is it?
It's called self-incompatibility.
Okay, self-incompatibility.
This is where the pistil can actually recognize pollen from its own plant.
What?
Yeah.
And reject it.
So it's like a chemical handshake, right?
Yeah.
And the pistil's like, nope, you're too close. I'm not interested.
Exactly.
How does that even work?
It's all about genetics.
Okay.
There are these genes that control the compatibility
Right.
between the pollen and the pistil.
Yeah.
And if the pollen and pistil share certain versions of these genes, the pistil will activate a cascade of biochemical reactions that prevent the pollen grain from, germinating or growing its pollen tube down to the ovary.
So it's like a security system
Yeah.
that only allows compatible pollen to enter.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so let's say a pollen grain has passed all the tests, right?
Okay.
And is allowed to germinate.
Yeah.
What happens then?
So the pollen grain.
After it lands on that compatible stigma,
Yeah.
starts to germinate.
Okay.
And it grows this pollen tube
Okay.
that extends down through the style,
Yeah.
guided by chemical signals from the pistil.
Okay.
So this pollen tube is like a lifeline carrying those male gametes towards the ovule, which awaits in the ovary.
So the pollen tube is like a tunnel, burrowing through the style to reach the ovule.
Yeah.
But what happens when it finally arrives?
You're right. It's the culmination of all these intricate processes, right?
Right.
So the pollen tube enters the ovule through this small opening called the micropyle.
Okay.
And releases its two male gametes into the embryo sac.
Okay, and that's the moment of fertilization.
That's it.
Right.
Yeah, and this is where, this is where things get really interesting because flowering plants have this unique process called double fertilization.
Double fertilization?
Yeah.
What's so double about it?
So in most organisms,
Okay.
fertilization involves one male gamete fusing with one female gamete.
Right, right.
But in flowering plants,
Yeah.
you get a 2-for-1 deal.
It's like buy one, get one free.
Yeah, so one of the male gametes fuses with the egg cell to form the zygote, which will eventually develop into the embryo.
Okay.
That's the classic fertilization we're all familiar with.
Right, right.
But the other male gamete
Yeah.
fuses with two polar nuclei in the central cell of the embryo sac, forming the primary endosperm nucleus.
Wait, so there are two fusion events happening at the same time.
That's right.
One creates the zygote,
Yeah.
and the other creates
the primary endosperm nucleus.
the primary endosperm nucleus.
Yeah, and that's where the double fertilization comes from, right?
Okay.
So this primary endosperm nucleus will go on to develop into the endosperm,
Okay.
which is this nutrient-rich tissue that surrounds and nourishes the developing embryo.
So it's like the embryo gets its own pantry stocked with all these snacks?
Exactly. The endosperm is so crucial for providing the embryo with the energy and resources it needs to grow.
Okay.
Think about coconut water.
Yeah.
That's essentially liquid endosperm.
Wow.
Or the white fluffy part of popcorn that you enjoy, that's endosperm too.
This double fertilization business is blowing my mind.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
How much complexity is packed into these, tiny structures
Right.
and processes.
We've come a long way from that bee buzzing around a flower.
We have.
Okay, so now we have a fertilized ovule.
Yeah.
How does that transform into a feed?
That's what we're going to talk about next.
All right. Okay, so now we have this fertilized ovule.
Yes.
How does that transform into a seed?
Well, it's like watching, this tiny plant nursery taking shape, right? And it all starts with those integuments that we talked about.
They're like protective layers.
Exactly. So they develop into the tough seed coat that,
that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, and the micropyle. That little opening that allowed the pollen tube to get in, that persists as this tiny pore.
Yeah, okay.
And that's really crucial because it allows water and oxygen to get into the seed during germination.
So it's like a little doorway for the essentials of life to get in there.
Exactly.
So what about the inside of the seed?
Okay.
We have the zygote, which will become the embryo.
Right.
And we have the endosperm, which is the food supply.
Yes.
How did those develop?
So the endosperm really starts to take off first.
Okay.
That primary endosperm cell divides rapidly
Okay.
and provides this burst of energy to get things going.
Right.
And sometimes it forms a free nuclear endosperm,
Yeah.
which is where you have a bunch of nuclei before any cell walls form.
Okay.
Other times it goes straight to cellular endosperm,
Okay.
where the cell walls form right away. So it's like choosing between, a buffet style or pre-plated meal.
Yeah. Okay. So the endosperm's getting ready. What about the zygote? Is it just kind of waiting around for the feces to be prepared?
Not at all. It starts developing too,
Okay.
but usually only after some endosperm has been formed.
Oh, okay.
It's like the plant wants to make sure there's a reliable food source
Yeah. Yeah.
before the embryo starts to grow.
Makes sense.
And this development process is called embryogeny.
Embryogeny.
And it goes through several really interesting stages.
Okay. So the zygote's on its own developmental journey here.
It is.
What are some of the milestones along the way?
So it starts as a proembryo.
Okay.
Just a simple cluster of cells. Then it becomes globular,
Okay.
kind of like a tiny ball. And then it takes on this heart shape,
Okay.
which is especially noticeable in dicots.
Dicots.
Yeah. The group of flowering plants that includes beans and peas.
Okay.
And finally, you have this mature embryo,
Okay.
which is this miniature plant in waiting, right?
All right.
With all its essential parts. A rudimentary root, a shoot, and one or two cotyledons.
Hold on.
This.
That sounds familiar.
Think of a bean seed.
Okay.
When it sprouts, those two halves of the seed that emerge above the ground,
Yeah.
those are the cotyledons.
Okay.
They're like seed leaves
Okay.
that store nutrients for the developing embryo.
Right. Right.
And dicots have two of those,
Yeah.
while monocots, which include grasses and grains,
Okay.
only have one.
Okay. That's coming back to me now. So we have a mature embryo
Yes.
nestled in its endosperm.
Okay.
All packaged within this protective seed coat.
Yeah,
It's amazing how much development
it is.
happening
A lot going on.
within that tiny seed.
Yeah.
But what about the ovary itself?
Okay.
We can't forget about the structure that housed all this activity.
You're right. The
Yeah.
ovary undergoes this pretty dramatic transformation of its own, developing into a fruit.
Fruit.
Yeah.
Now we're talking.
And that's, probably your favorite part of plant reproduction.
Well, I have to admit, the edible outcome is definitely a plus.
Of course.
But I always thought fruits were just about protecting the seeds.
Well, that's one purpose, but there's more to it than that.
Okay, so what else is going on?
So the fruit serves multiple purposes.
Okay.
Protection is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
So that ovary wall thickens,
Yeah.
develops into the pericarp,
Pericarp. Okay.
which can take on, so many different forms,
Okay.
depending on the plant.
So the pericarp is like the fruit's outer layer.
It is.
Okay. What kind of forms can it take?
Well, think about the difference between a peach and a walnut.
Okay.
A peach has this fleshy, juicy pericarp that animals just, can't resist.
Yeah.
But a walnut has this hard, woody pericarp that's like armor plating.
Makes sense. But why would a plant want its fruit to be eaten?
Ah, you're forgetting about seed dispersal.
Oh, right.
So that juicy peach is going to be eaten by an animal,
Yeah.
which will then wander off, right? And eventually deposit that seed, maybe with a little bit of fertilizer, in a new location far away from the parent plant.
It's like a free ride
It is.
for the seed.
Exactly. So fruits are these cleverly designed vehicles
Yeah.
for spreading seeds far and wide.
And that explains why some fruits are adapted for wind dispersal, right?
Yeah.
Like, the ones with those wings or parachutes.
Right.
And others are designed to float on water.
Exactly. The diversity of fruit types
It really is amazing.
is incredible.
But there's another twist
Okay.
to this story, right? Not all fruits develop from a fertilized ovary.
That's right.
What?
Yeah.
Fruits without fertilization. How is that possible?
Some plants can produce fruits without fertilization.
Wow.
It's a process called parthenocarpy.
Parthenocarpy.
Yeah, and a good example of this is bananas.
Bananas.
The bananas that we eat are actually seedless
Right.
because they develop from unfertilized ovaries.
So seedless bananas, that's incredible. But if there's no seeds, how do banana plants even reproduce?
They reproduce asexually through these suckers that sprout from the base of the plant.
Okay, so it's like cloning.
Yeah, it's kind of like cloning.
Okay, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
So this whole discussion about seeds and fruit, right?
Yeah.
Makes me wonder,
Yeah.
what if plants could just bypass that whole fertilization process altogether?
That's a great question.
Wouldn't that be even more efficient?
Well, it turns out some plants have figured out a way to do that. It's this fascinating phenomenon called apomixis.
Apomixis.
What is that? It's essentially asexual reproduction,
Okay.
disguised as sexual reproduction.
Okay.
So in some cases, the egg cell just develops directly into an embryo without being fertilized.
Oh.
In other cases, like in some citrus varieties and mangoes,
Yeah.
cells from the nucellus,
The nucellus.
which is the tissue surrounding the embryo sac,
Okay.
can actually develop into embryo.
So it's like a backup plan, right?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
In case pollination doesn't happen.
Yeah, and apomixis can also result in polyembryony,
Polyembryony.
which is where you get, multiple embryos developing within a single seed.
So have you ever squeezed an orange
Yeah.
and found like multiple seeds?
Yeah, that's polyembryony.
That's amazing. So why would plants evolve to do this? What's the advantage of apomixis?
Well, for one thing, it's this guaranteed way to reproduce.
Right.
Even if pollinators are scarce
Yeah.
or conditions aren't ideal for pollination, it also allows the plant to, faithfully pass on its traits to its offspring. So it's essentially creating clones.
So it ensures genetic consistency.
Exactly. And that's why apomixis is of great interest to plant breeders.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine being able to create these hybrid crops with, superior qualities.
Right.
And then have those hybrids reproduce themselves faithfully through apomixis. That would be huge.
Yeah, there would be no more need for, all that complicated
Right.
and expensive hybrid seed production every year.
That would change agriculture.
It would. So, wow, we covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
We started with the basics of sexual reproduction.
Yeah.
We went through, all those intricate details of pollination,
Pretty complex.
double fertilization,
Yeah.
seed and fruit development, and even, we explored apomixis.
It's really remarkable to consider that all these processes are happening, silently and invisibly all around us.
Yeah.
In the fields, forests, gardens that make up our world.
Right.
Plants are really the foundation of our ecosystems and our food supplies. So understanding how they reproduce is crucial for our own survival and well-being.
It's so easy to take plants for granted,
It is.
but this deep dive has given me such a new appreciation for their ingenuity and their resilience.
Yeah.
I'll never look at a flower or a fruit the same way again.
I hope our listeners feel the same way.
And I encourage our listeners to do the same.
Yeah.
Take a closer look at the plants. In your environment, think about all these incredible processes that are happening.
Absolutely.
You might be surprised by what you discover.
And remember, there's always more to learn.
Yeah.
The world of plant science is constantly evolving,
Right.
with new discoveries happening all the time. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop being curious about the natural world.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of plant reproduction.
My pleasure.